A letter was composed from my husband and subsequently torn into fragments. This action was not driven by anger, but rather by the realization that I no longer required his acknowledgement for my sense of existence. I am currently 40 years of age. I previously perceived myself as an unnoticed presence within a household where my husband had ceased to acknowledge my existence. My son is scheduled to depart shortly. Subsequently, my son Jake transported me to a cabin situated within a snowy forest. In the frigid temperatures, I experienced a revival of my sense of vitality, primarily through the act of laughter. A fall in the snow, accompanied by a photograph, prompted a realization. I remain unchanged. Have you ever existed for others to such an extent that you lost sight of your former self? Please share your experience, as it is possible that my path of awakening commenced in a manner similar to yours. The experience of entering a wooden cabin situated within a snow-covered pine forest was unexpected, particularly in the company of my son. However, there are instances where unplanned events serve as critical turning points that are essential for progress. Jake reached the age of 21 last month. His height was nearly comparable to mine, and while he maintained a quiet demeanor, his eyes consistently conveyed a gentle warmth, demonstrating a silent observance. The inquiry he made that morning was, "Mom, would you like to go somewhere for a few days?" Caused me to stop and reflect. It appears that my son observed the lack of emotion in my eyes, the meals during which his father, David, had been missing for extended periods, and my routine of cleaning the kitchen each night, driven solely by habit. A small cabin is located near a lake, which was the site of a camping trip with my class. She exhibits a state of calmness and possesses notable beauty. Jake stated, his hands positioned steadily on the steering wheel. The journey commenced without established plans or a defined itinerary, involving a mother and her son ascending the mountain. As the vehicle transitioned onto the snow-covered roadway, I experienced a sense of emotional expansion. The environment was characterized by the presence of pine trees, exhibiting a silent and white appearance. The wind moved through the bare branches, and the cabin became visible, small, aged, yet exuding a warmth reminiscent of a memory. Jake opened the door swiftly. "It is similar to previous instances," he stated with a smile. The room featured an old fireplace, wool-upholstered armchairs, and a faded oak dining table, evoking a sense of nostalgia. I remained in silence for an extended period. For the past 15 years, I have resided in an environment characterized by gas stoves, washing machines, and the auditory presence of David's business calls. A significant duration had elapsed since I last occupied a space designated solely for my personal use. The onset of night occurred rapidly. Snowfall has commenced once more. Jake ignited the fire and I removed my wool scarves. I positioned myself on the carpet on the floor, observing the movement of the flames. The experience resembled a return to a more primitive and straightforward era. "Is there a need for sustenance?" I inquired with Sarah. Jake acknowledged with a nod. "Even instant noodles are acceptable, provided that you share the meal with me." I experienced a strong emotional response. I had overlooked the value of sitting down to eat with someone at a leisurely pace, without the need to merely serve as background noise in the conversation, which was a significant aspect of the cabin experience. Jake and I were seated in a comfortable arrangement, partaking in our meal collaboratively. The lack of conversation created an atmosphere that felt more comforting than any birthday celebration I had previously arranged. During the night, I positioned myself on the compact wooden bed, enveloped in a substantial feather blanket, while observing the ceiling of the cabin. The sound of the wind interacting with the tin roof was audible, accompanied by the soft crackling of firewood from the opposite side of the room. Additionally, Jake's gentle breathing could be heard. He is my only son, who has helped me recover from a cold that I believed was insurmountable. Upon reflection, it became apparent that this journey was not merely an escape from the cold. It represented a potential starting point for a renewed existence. The faint aroma of coffee was detected seeping through the crack of the wooden door upon waking. The morning light passed through the thin linen curtain, creating a soft illumination that enveloped the room. I exited the bed, donned a wool sweater, and observed Jake positioned by the kitchen window, holding a cup of coffee. Holding a cup of coffee, he gazes into the distance, observing the snow-covered landscape. "Did you rise early?" I inquired softly, concerned about interrupting the tranquil atmosphere. Jake executed a turn and displayed a smile. This location encourages the preservation of each moment, and additionally, I prepare high-quality coffee. I would like to attempt one. The rocking chair was positioned adjacent to the fireplace. Jake provided me with the cup of coffee. The warmth provided a sense of comfort. No further communication occurred between us. The auditory environment consisted solely of the crunching of snow on the porch, the gentle crackling of firewood in the stove, and the rhythmic inhalation of a mother engaged in the process of rediscovering the ability to remain still. The entire morning was dedicated to organizing the cabin. This activity was not a necessity. Rather, it served as a collaborative task for us to engage in together. Jake performed the task of cleaning the windows, while I engaged in folding blankets and organizing some old items within the wooden closet. Each individual task represented an effort to restore the link that had been neglected between mother and son. The last instance of our uninterrupted time together is not readily recalled, as it was marked by the absence of distractions such as phones, emails, or minor disputes. In that context, the atmosphere was characterized by simplicity and ease. At noon, precipitation in the form of snow continued, although the atmospheric conditions had improved with a clearer sky. Jake removed me from the cabin. "Have you ever participated in skiing activities?" "Mom?" I responded with a chuckle, slightly averting my gaze as I examined the substantial snowshoes presented to me. "I am more accustomed to navigating through markets. Today we are entering the forest." We proceeded together into the soft snow. The feet made contact with the unblemished white surface, resulting in a gentle sinking effect. The pine forest exhibited a state of tranquility. The only audible elements were the sounds of our breathing and the sporadic cracking of branches. The experience of walking unexpectedly resulted in a profound sense of peace. Upon my entry, John positioned his palm on top of mine. He provided details regarding his past camping excursions with friends. His voice exhibited a departure from its typical dry and sharp quality, now characterized by warmth and a notable enthusiasm. I observed that my son had experienced growth. The individual exhibited not only a notable stature, but also demonstrated attentive listening skills and maintained a non-judgmental gaze, allowing for a patient interaction. Upon reaching a clearing, Jake stated, "During childhood, whenever you experienced a headache or felt unwell, you consistently went to the backyard. It appears that my observation went unnoticed by you." I became immobile. I assumed your age would limit your comprehension. Jake performed a deliberate headshake indicating contemplation. "I observed the situation and have consistently hoped that you had a support system in place to alleviate the burden of facing it alone." I averted my gaze, rapidly blinking to suppress the tears. At that moment, I perceived Jake not merely as my son, but as a young man exhibiting significant understanding and maturity. A portion of my being experienced a sense of support. Upon returning to the cabin, I positioned myself on the porch steps, experiencing a flush in my cheeks due to the cold temperature. Ak provided a cup of hot ginger tea. "What is your desired destination for tomorrow, Mother?" I observed the snow falling silently and shook my head in response. "Will you be extending your stay for a few additional days?" The objective was to prolong the sensation of rediscovery, a sentiment that, after many years in the roles of wife and mother, had led to a disconnection from my true self, unencumbered by the expectation of perfection that evening. The residence was enveloped in an atypical silence. David had not yet returned home. The final plate from the birthday preparations was dried in the kitchen. The towel was subsequently hung on its designated hook. Jake was located on the upper floor. The auditory output from his room consisted of soft music, instrumental melodies that consistently resembled a whisper, lacking a definitive meaning. I contemplated whether he was reflecting on the events that transpired at the beach. The thought persisted in my mind. The individual entered the living room. The individual positioned themselves on the sofa and placed a lightweight blanket over their legs. The objects within this residence were distinctly recognizable, from the reading lamp exhibiting a broken hinge to the faded wedding photograph positioned at a slight angle on the wall. All elements appeared to be integrated into my existence. At this point, I found myself questioning whether I was actively engaging in my life or merely fulfilling a predetermined role assigned by another. I exhaled audibly. At that moment, I detected faint footsteps ascending the stairs. Subsequently, Jake made his entrance. The door, positioned with a glass of water, exhibited no signs of drowsiness and was prepared to articulate, "T, I am also not experiencing sleepiness." He approached and took a seat next to me. We maintained our grip on the glass for several seconds while remaining silent. Subsequently, I initiated verbal communication. "Did you perceive any notable differences in today's experience?" Jake directed his gaze towards me and executed a slight nod. "Your behavior appeared atypical, somewhat detached." A slight smile was given. It is possible that age plays a role when one reaches a certain stage. Individuals often exhibit a tendency to focus on the items or experiences that have been lost. "You have not lost anything," Jake stated. His voice prompted me to turn and meet his gaze. "You are the individual responsible for maintaining cohesion. In the absence of your contributions, it is likely that this family would have experienced significant disintegration some time ago." The muscles of my heart contracted. Jake's words served as a subtle yet poignant reminder. Did I genuinely maintain cohesion, or was I merely feigning ignorance towards the flaws? "David, regarding your father, do you perceive that he is gradually becoming less present?" Jake remained quiet. Following an extended pause, he responded, "It is my assessment that he departed an extended period in the past." I closed my eyes, not due to surprise, but because I had not previously articulated it aloud. My son has now validated this information. "However, your presence remains," Jake continued. "I am also included." We continue to support one another. I directed my attention to my son, appreciative of his remarks. Jake provided a sense of comfort and support. At that moment, I perceived him not as the child I once carried, but as an adult, an individual possessing the capacity for empathy and understanding of suffering. It went unnoticed even by my husband, remained silent. We remained seated in silence, attuned to the rhythmic ticking of the clock, which seemed to provide a moment for reflection and contemplation. Despite David's loss of self-identity, it was evident that my son still recognized my presence. The duration of my sitting there after Jake returned to his room is uncertain, possibly a few minutes or perhaps an hour. Upon standing, the typical fog and fatigue abruptly dissipated, akin to the removal of a dense curtain from my consciousness. Upon entering the bathroom, I activated the light and observed my reflection in the mirror. The visage reflected was no longer that of the young woman depicted in the old wedding photograph I had been familiar with for an extended period. On that night, after an extended period, I gained a clear perception of my own identity. I was no longer identified as David's wife or merely Jake's mother. I was simply myself, a woman gradually becoming engulfed in the stillness of days devoid of inquiries about my well-being, in the repetitiveness of meals characterized by silence, in a form of unspoken sacrifice so persistent that I had even lost awareness of its existence. I positioned both hands on the sink. I released a quick breath. A minor sensation of coldness traversed my spine. It was not discomfort, it was understanding. I recalled my initial experiences in the roles of a wife and mother. I once envisioned establishing a small bakery, authoring a book, and acquiring proficiency in another language. However, gradually, I integrated these aspirations into family dinners, Jake's commendable behavior, and David's work commitments. David, if I had existed solely for the benefit of others and overlooked this fundamental principle, that when a woman ceases to prioritize her own existence, she becomes invisible even in her physical presence. In each family photograph, a tear descended my cheek. However, this instance did not signify self-pity. It represented a moment of awakening. I no longer wished to remain the unnoticed component of this household. I did not wish to be the individual for whom David expressed mere gratitude for my patience. I did not wish to be solely identified as the mother. Jake observed me with a quiet expression of sorrow as I gradually disappeared into the stillness. I aimed to rediscover my voice. I aimed to select a day characterized by music, curiosity, and elements that would elicit a smile without a specific cause. Uncertainty surrounded my decision making process. However, one fact was clear: tomorrow would present a distinct change. I observed my reflection in the mirror. The dark circles remained present. However, there was an indication of an emotion resembling pride. There was no requirement for me to be younger, more attractive, or to receive validation from others. My only necessity was to remain authentic to my genuine feelings that evening. I reclined and shut my eyes, not experiencing anxiety or regret, but rather a renewed and profound sense of tranquility, akin to having just weathered a storm and now standing beneath the initial light of dawn. The phone rang abruptly, interrupting my transition into sleep and jolting me back to a state of wakefulness, as if my dream was left incomplete. I observed the time displayed on the clock. Duration: 2 minutes and 8 seconds. I abruptly sat up. The heart rate was elevated. The first thought that occurred to me was the name of my son, Jake. Without hesitation, I reached for the phone. My voice exhibited a noticeable tremor. "Hello." A deep, urgent male voice was transmitted from the other end. "Are you the spouse of David?" I became immobile. "Yes, what is the issue?" "This is a communication from the Central Hospital. David, your husband, experienced a collapse while engaged in work during the late hours. The patient is presently receiving treatment in the cardiology emergency unit. Please respond at your earliest convenience." I rose to a standing position. In that moment of surprise, my response was simply, "I'm on my way." The vehicle was operated continuously throughout the night, with a firm grip maintained on the steering wheel. The streets exhibited a lack of pedestrian and vehicular activity. The amber streetlights extended in a linear arrangement, reminiscent of memories stored in my mind. Inquiries circulated within my mind. Is this David? Were there any indications present? What factors contributed to my oversight? The most surprising aspect was the sensation experienced in my chest. I did not experience fear regarding the potential loss of David. I experienced a sense of restlessness due to an unresolved matter, an incomplete thought, despite my belief that I had progressed beyond it. I arrived at the hospital and proceeded to the waiting room promptly. The closed emergency doors captured my attention. A short time later, a young physician exited and took off his mask. He is no longer in a critical condition. Fortunately, he was admitted at the appropriate moment. I expressed my gratitude, yet my heart continued to race as I was granted entry. David was positioned in a prone state, exhibiting signs of pallor and fatigue. The expression previously characterized by coldness and distance now exhibited an unexpected vulnerability. I remained stationary for an extended duration prior to taking a seat next to him. David initiated visual contact by opening his eyes and directing his gaze towards me. The expression conveyed a sense of fatigue and sincerity, devoid of any dramatic elements. He communicated in a low voice. "I apologize for all that has transpired." I was uncertain about how to respond. At that moment, all the anger, emptiness, and disappointment I had held onto appeared to dissipate. David, the husband I believed had become absorbed in his work, was, in this moment, exhibiting greater fragility. As I, a woman in the early stages of rediscovering my identity, confronted the inquiry: should he undergo genuine transformation? What actions will I take that evening? While positioned adjacent to the hospital bed, I remained awake. However, the impulse to flee had dissipated. I was uncertain about the outcomes involving David, myself, and Jake. However, one fact was clear to me. Every journey toward awakening involves interruptions, as it is during these moments that we gain a clear understanding of our desired destination. A week following David's discharge from the hospital, the residents exhibited an unusual silence, elimination of abrupt door closures, and late-night telephone communications. David commenced remote work. The physician indicated that a period of complete rest for a minimum of 3 weeks is required. He accepted the situation, albeit with reluctance. Meanwhile, I was uncertain about how to address the newly created distance between us. I continued my routine of rising early, brewing coffee, organizing the kitchen, and preparing breakfast for Jake. However, I noticed that David was now occupying the previously empty chair at the table. Polite glances were exchanged. accompanied by a series of health-related inquiries, after which silence once again permeated the kitchen. On that afternoon, as Jake departed to meet his friends, I proceeded to enter David's improvised office space. He was observing the view outside the window as though an external element could provide relief from the unexpressed thoughts and feelings. I initially stated, "Please hold, we must." He rotated his body to face the opposite direction. His eyes exhibited signs of fatigue, yet they maintained direct contact with mine. I occupied the chair positioned opposite him. There was a prolonged silence between us. Subsequently, I inquired, "Have you ever recognized the extent of my loneliness?" He observed me briefly before nodding. However, he was uncertain about the next steps to take. Employment was the sole area in which I perceived my competence to remain intact. I emitted a sound characterized by a lack of moisture, commonly referred to as a dry laugh. "What about me? Additionally, Jake, all the dinners for which I waited alone?" He remained silent, directing his gaze downward and clasping his hands as though seeking an answer within that gesture. "I understand your anger," David articulated deliberately, yet he was apprehensive that pausing would compel him to confront the reality of the situation. "I am no longer the individual you previously selected." The sensation in my chest constricted as I reflected on the numerous years we cohabited. David had previously concealed his armor, but that was no longer the case. I inhaled deeply and stated, "I do not require an individual who is flawless. I simply seek someone who is genuinely engaged." David raised his gaze for the first time in several years. His eyes exhibited a clouded appearance. "I believed I had lost you, David. However, the most frightening aspect was I had previously experienced a loss of self." The conversation concluded without a resolution. However, it marked an authentic initiation. There were no grand gestures or promises made, nor was there any physical display of affection such as hugging. While in a state of emotional distress, I did not attempt to revise our previous romantic narrative. Instead, for the first time in an extended period, we perceived one another beyond our assigned roles or responsibilities, engaging with genuine understanding. On that particular night, Jake arrived home while positioned near the kitchen window. I turned to observe my son, who remained the child I once recognized, yet was developing with each passing hour. This journey of healing may not solely pertain to David and me. It encompasses the entire family, which previously perceived itself as fractured. Jake refrained from inquiring when he observed David and me seated at the table that evening. His gaze scanned the group, displaying a combination of surprise and caution, akin to observing a familiar environment where the arrangement of furniture had been altered. She rises from the floor. A bowl of soup was provided to her. My hands exhibited slight tremors. David carefully transferred a portion of rice into his bowl. The atmosphere was subdued, characterized by a silence that lacked the previous burden, resembling the initial tones of a song entering its prelude phase. Following the completion of dinner, Jake proceeded to the upstairs area. I exhaled, considering that he likely required some time. However, less than 15 minutes later, a soft knock was heard on my bedroom door. "Mother, are you currently occupied?" I turned around. Jake positioned himself in the doorway, devoid of any mobile device or headphones. My son, now significantly taller, possesses an unspoken depth in his gaze. I moved my head from side to side. "Please enter and take a seat in the chair." I remained silent for a brief period. He spoke in a low tone, cautious as though he might disrupt something delicate. "Are you and Dad in a good state again?" "Not truly." The inquiry rendered me momentarily speechless. I intended to respond promptly. However, I took a moment to pause. His eyes lacked any sign of curiosity. The observation indicated a presence of concern, accompanied by an unspoken desire for clarity, yet also an underlying fear of potential emotional harm. "I am uncertain," I responded candidly. "However, it appears that we are beginning to communicate in a more authentic manner once more." Jake acknowledged the situation with a nod and directed his gaze downward, unconsciously pulling at a loose thread on the sleeve of his sweatshirt. "I believe I was raised in an environment where communication was frequent, yet substantive content was lacking." A sensation of constriction developed in my throat, and at times I experienced a feeling of being positioned between two unfamiliar individuals, attempting to maintain stability and prevent disarray. I approached and took a seat next to him. I carefully positioned my hand over his. "It is unnecessary for you to carry that, Jake. It is imperative that no child is subjected to such a burden." Jake raised his gaze, his eyes exhibiting a red rim. "If it is not me, then who is it?" My heart was fragmented. I held him tightly, marking the first genuine hug in an extended period. Within that embrace, I recognized a realization that had previously eluded my consideration. The silence had worn down not only David and me. Jake was also affected by the vacant areas we had abandoned following. The individual exited the room. I remained seated, experiencing a sense of restlessness. The initiation of the healing process may not necessarily begin with the marriage itself. The process initiates with the resolve to confront the emotional injuries we have inflicted on our closest,